In Renaissance Italy, while kings across Europe proclaimed themselves instruments of divine will, a different kind of authority ruled after sunset in Rome. It did not wear a crown. It wore the tiara, and its name was Borgia. Behind the fortified walls of the Vatican, beneath ceilings painted with saints and angels, the Borgia family transformed the center of Christendom into something far less restrained. Faith, desire, ambition, and corruption blended into a single currency of power. These were not rumors whispered centuries later. They were recorded in real time by a man whose position placed him closer than anyone else to the truth. Johann Burchard, master of ceremonies to the Pope, was responsible for organizing liturgies, processions, and sacred rituals. But his access did not end at the altar. Night after night, he witnessed what unfolded behind closed doors, and he wrote it down with the same precision he used to document holy feasts. His diary, Liber Notarum, remains one of the most uncomfortable primary sources in Vatican history. Scholars may debate interpretation, but no serious historian disputes that the events themselves occurred. Everything changed in 1492, when Rodrigo Borgia ascended the papal throne as Alexander VI. This was not a pope shaped by ascetic discipline. He was a seasoned political operator, deeply invested in legacy, influence, and indulgence. Under his rule, the Vatican became less a spiritual refuge and more a palace state where access meant everything. By daylight, diplomats from France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire negotiated treaties beneath frescoed ceilings. By night, those same halls filled with musicians, courtesans, displaced nobles, and soldiers seeking advancement. Everyone understood the rules. Favor was earned, not prayed for. At the heart of these gatherings was a chamber later referred to as the Borgia apartments. Officially, they were ceremonial rooms adorned by Pinturicchio. After dusk, curtains were drawn, candles multiplied, and the space was repurposed entirely. Wine flowed freely. Music echoed against marble. Hierarchies dissolved or were quietly rearranged. One evening in October 1500 stands out even among these excesses. Burchard recorded it without embellishment. Later generations would call it the Banquet of the Chestnuts. According to his account, dozens of courtesans were invited, adorned only in jewelry that marked their patron's wealth. Chestnuts were scattered across the marble floor, and the women were ordered to retrieve them as the audience observed. Laughter followed. Applause followed. But the spectacle was not meant to entertain alone. After the feast, competitions were arranged, not merely for pleasure, but for reward. Those who distinguished themselves were granted privileges far more valuable than gold: private access, protection, advancement, in some cases, proximity to the most dangerous rooms in Rome. What mattered most was not the act itself, but its purpose. For the Borgias, intimacy was leverage. These nights were instruments of statecraft. A man who indulged could be compromised. A man who hesitated could be measured. Shame, desire, loyalty, all were assessed and catalogued. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's son, understood this better than anyone. On the battlefield, he was feared for his efficiency. Within the Vatican, he observed quietly who sought whom, who faltered, who revealed insecurity beneath confidence. He learned more in candlelit chambers than many generals learned through war. The Vatican, under the Borgias, became a controlled environment, a place where morality was suspended and power was tested. What unfolded there was not chaos. It was design. And that is what unsettles historians most. These were not excesses born of indulgence alone. They were deliberate, calculated, used to bind allies, expose rivals, and ensure silence. The Renaissance celebrated beauty, faith, and human potential. But in Rome, under the Borgias, those ideals were weaponized. And the echoes of those nights would shape European politics long after the candles burned out. Above all these nights hovered the name of Lucrezia Borgia. History reduced her to caricature, a seductress, a poisoner, a willing accomplice. The reality is colder and more tragic. Lucrezia was not the architect of the scandals attributed to her. She was currency, married and remarried to serve alliances, discarded when treaties shifted. Her name became a convenient vessel for rumor. The Borgias allowed it. A family feared is more powerful than one merely obeyed. That is what makes these accounts so unsettling. None of this unfolded in distant castles or shadow border courts. It happened at the very heart of Christendom, inside the Vatican, funded by tithes, indulgences, and offerings given in good faith by millions who believed they were sustaining the Church. While Europe's monarchs entertained themselves with mass balls and courtly games, the Borgias pushed further. They transformed the papal palace into a space where restraint dissolved entirely. Ambassadors arrived expecting diplomacy. Many left altered. They had witnessed scenes that contradicted everything Christian authority claimed to represent. Yet they said nothing. Silence was safer. Silence preserved careers. Silence preserved lives. Because under the Borgias, the Church was no longer merely an institution. It had become the private instrument of a family that blurred the boundary between sacred authority and personal domination, and the excesses did not end there. Each successive gathering tested new limits. Each night redefined what could be done without consequence. To understand how the papacy eclipsed even Europe's most decadent courts, one must look beyond the spectacle. The real power lay not in the rebels themselves, but in what surrounded them. Every invitation was deliberate. Every seating arrangement mattered. Every glance was noted. Nothing occurred by accident. Cesare Borgia understood this instinctively. He knew that men did not expose themselves in council chambers or on battlefields. They did so when vigilance collapsed, when desire, pride, and fear overlapped. These nights were not indulgence for him. They were reconnaissance. At court, Cesare's reputation preceded him. Some admired him as a prince of the New Age. Others feared him as something far more dangerous. What cannot be disputed is his insight. Intimacy disarms more effectively than steel. A sword may defeat an enemy once. Compromise controls him for life. When a nobleman or envoy received an invitation, he understood the risk. Participation meant vulnerability. Refusal meant suspicion. Somewhere in the room, Cesare would be watching, not openly, not aggressively, but with precision. Observation was his true craft. Chroniclers describe men of rigid discipline unraveling over the course of a single evening. The atmosphere was engineered for this outcome. Music softened resistance. Wine dulled caution. Familiar boundaries dissolved. And when a man crossed a line, any line, he could be isolated. Isolation was Cesare's preferred method. A private conversation, a confidential favor, a quiet reminder of what had been seen. Once separated from the protection of reputation, a man became manageable, and manageable men moved armies, redirected funds, delayed warnings, or signed treaties that reshaped Italy. The Vatican, under the Borgias, was not merely corrupt. It was efficient, and this is why their legacy endures. Not because of scandal alone, but because they revealed something deeply unsettling about power. That domination does not always rely on force. Sometimes it relies on understanding exactly when a man stops being who he claims to be. Amid the noise and movement of these gatherings, Cesare moved deliberately. He approached certain guests quietly, drawing them aside into shadowed corners or empty corridors. His words were never rushed. He spoke of appointments that could be arranged, estates that might change hands, investigations that could be delayed or silenced altogether. Others he offered nothing tangible at all, only reassurance that what had occurred would remain unspoken. Many accepted immediately. Some hesitated. A few visibly shook. But all of them understood the same truth by the end of the conversation. Usefulness guaranteed protection. Resistance invited destruction. Pope Alexander was not detached from this process. From his private chambers, he observed his son's work with approval. He understood exactly what Cesare was building, not a faction bound by ideology, but a web of obligation and fear. Moral debt, once incurred, was far more reliable than loyalty purchased with coin. In the days that followed these nights, Alexander summoned select participants to his apartments. His manner was calm, almost paternal. He spoke softly of forgiveness, of human weakness, of divine mercy. He assured them that indulgence did not sever one's relationship with God, but the reassurance carried weight precisely because it was paired with knowledge. These men understood that absolution was being offered by someone who had already seen their vulnerability laid bare. The forgiveness was real, but so was the leverage. During this period, the Vatican ceased to resemble a religious center at all. It functioned instead as a parallel state. The corridors were thick with scent: ink, wine, incense, perfume. Servants whispered. Cardinals watched one another closely. Trust eroded. It was known that after dusk, discreet entrances opened. Visitors arrived without record. Women from the city, impoverished nobles seeking advantage, intermediaries chosen for their connections rather than their virtue. Rome talked, but carefully. Everyone knew the rumors: the Pope's mistresses, Cesare's affairs, Lucrezia's marriages arranged like diplomatic instruments. Yet the reality beneath the gossip was colder and more deliberate. These were not excesses without purpose. Every encounter carried intent. A treaty might begin with a shared indulgence. A rival could be undone by a carefully released whisper. Reputation became a weapon sharper than steel. One account describes a particular gathering where several Roman noble families were invited under the guise of celebration. Historians believe Cesare's objective was simple: identify which houses were considering open opposition. Wine flowed. Inhibitions weakened. Words slipped free that would never have been spoken in daylight. By morning, arrests had begun. The evening had not been a celebration. It had been a test. Other chronicles describe nights when the Vatican doors were sealed so abruptly that even the staff lost track of who remained inside. These were the most dangerous evenings. Decisions were made that did not require parchment. Alliances were finalized without witnesses. Families rose or fell before dawn. For the Borgias, there was no boundary between the sacred and the profane. Authority flowed seamlessly between altar and chamber. Faith provided legitimacy. Intimacy provided control. And by the time their enemies understood how completely these forces had been fused, resistance was no longer an option. During these years, fear of the Borgias spread so deeply through Roman society that certain families made a quiet but drastic choice. Rather than entrust their daughters to convents, they sent them far from Rome altogether, beyond the reach of a court where innocence could become leverage and lineage a liability. The city itself had become a living web, spun patiently by Cesare, overseen by the Pope, and sustained by rumor, desire, terror, and silence. Yet this was only the opening act. The Borgias' greatest error was still to come: the belief that their power had made them untouchable. To grasp the true nature of their dominance, one must look beyond the spectacle of the knights themselves and examine the silent strategies that surrounded them. Nothing unfolded by chance. Every smile was deliberate. Every gesture carried intent. Cesare Borgia understood something most rulers learned too late: that men rarely reveal their weaknesses in war. They reveal them when pride falters, when fear clouds judgment, when desire loosens restraint. Those knights became his chosen terrain. Within the papal court, Cesare's reputation was unmistakable. He was known as the enfant terrible of the Vatican. To some, he appeared a brilliant prince of a new age. To others, a calculating predator. What no one doubted was his insight. Influence exercised over private weakness could achieve what armies could not. An invitation to one of these gatherings was never trivial. A nobleman, ambassador, or merchant knew that nothing he did would go unnoticed. Observation itself was a signal. If Cesare watched, consequences would follow. Chroniclers describe men of immense discipline, seasoned diplomats, hardened aristocrats, who unraveled during these evenings. Music blurred restraint. Wine softened caution. Carefully chosen provocations unsettled even the most composed. The Borgias understood that domination began with disorientation. Once control slipped, vulnerability followed. and vulnerability was power waiting to be claimed. Cesare's preferred method came next: separation. Amid the noise and movement, he would quietly draw select individuals aside. His words were low, precise. He spoke of opportunities that could be arranged, lands that might be granted, accusations that could disappear. Sometimes he promised nothing at all, only discretion. The reactions varied. Some agreed instantly. Others hesitated. A few trembled openly. But every one of them left with the same understanding. Usefulness ensured protection. Obstruction invited ruin. Pope Alexander was no passive observer. From within his apartments, he followed his son's maneuvers with approval. He recognized what Cesare was constructing. Not loyalty in the traditional sense, but a network of obligation and fear. Moral debt once incurred, bound tighter than gold. In the days that followed, the Pope summoned certain participants privately. His demeanor was gentle, almost paternal. He spoke of forgiveness, of human frailty, of divine mercy that outweighed fleshly error. Yet these words were never simply consolation. They carried an unspoken reminder. The Borgias had seen everything. They remembered everything. And those who had been seen now owed silence and obedience. It was whispered throughout Rome that the Borgia room had witnessed scenes too compromising to ever be spoken aloud. Courtesans were said to have been selected not for pleasure alone, but for their ability to unsettle senators and seduce diplomats. Cardinals, once cloaked in dignity, were rumored to have been caught in moments of humiliating weakness. Names circulated quietly at first, then more boldly. Each retelling sharpened the accusations. Each embellishment made the scandal heavier. In truth, a single rumor was enough. It fed a machine of shame already set in motion by rivals who had waited years for this moment. The backlash struck with unprecedented force. Pope Alexander, once untouchable, began to feel the ground shift beneath him. Cardinals who had once smiled indulgently at his excesses now avoided his gaze. Foreign princes, alarmed by reports flooding their courts, threatened to withdraw alliances that had sustained Borgia influence. For the first time, the family feared not only their enemies, but their own past. What had been concealed through silence and fear was now spilling into the open, impossible to contain. Cesare Borgia felt the change immediately. For all his brilliance and ruthlessness, he found himself increasingly alone. His relentless ambition had left devastation in its wake. Families ruined, nobles dispossessed, commanders humiliated. Across Italy, resentment had quietly matured into resolve. The condottieri who had once obeyed him out of fear now saw opportunity. They reclaimed territories, revived abandoned alliances, and allowed old grudges to surface. The balance of power was shifting. And then Cesare committed the error that history would remember as inevitable. Not an act of panic, but one of arrogance. Convinced that his reputation alone could still command obedience, he ordered another grand gathering, larger, louder, more defiant than any before. It was meant as a declaration, a message to Rome, to Italy, to Europe itself. The Borgias remained untouchable. The hall was prepared with meticulous care. Rich crimson fabrics glowed beneath the chandeliers. Music echoed without pause. Performers were brought from across the peninsula, chosen to dazzle and distract. Witnesses later claimed that this was no longer merely a celebration, but challenge, a family standing defiantly against the world. Cesare entered dressed in black velvet, flanked by his personal guard. He laughed openly, drank freely, and made a show of confidence. Every gesture was calculated to project dominance. Yet beneath the spectacle, an unease spread. Guests exchanged nervous glances. Conversations faltered. Eyes drifted repeatedly toward the doors. Something was wrong. Near midnight, a messenger forced his way inside, dust-covered, breathless, insistent. He demanded Cesare at once. The message he carried required no elaboration. A coalition of rival families, reinforced by foreign forces, was already in motion. What had been postponed for years was finally unfolding. Cesare's expression hardened. The charm vanished. In its place appeared something colder, more dangerous. He understood immediately that the hall which had once served as an instrument of domination was now irrelevant. The illusion had shattered. He ordered the celebration ended. The music ceased. Performers froze where they stood. Conversations died mid-sentence. Guests stared at one another in silence, aware that they were witnessing not a party's conclusion, but the beginning of a reckoning. The candlelight trembled against the walls. One chronicler later wrote that this silence was more frightening than any excess that had ever filled the room. It was a sound of power collapsing inward. Cesare Borgia left the hall swearing vengeance, convinced he could still bend events to his will. But the truth had already asserted itself. The Borgias were no longer hunters. They had become quarry. What followed was swift and merciless. Rome turned its back on them. Doors that once opened instantly were now barred. Families that had survived by obedience suddenly defected. Cardinals, sensing the shift, united under the language of reform, though each understood it was also an act of survival. Across Italy, cities declared independence. Lands were seized. Alliances dissolved overnight. The invisible empire the Borgias had built through fear and indulgence disintegrated without a single decisive battle. Then came the final fracture. Pope Alexander VI fell gravely ill. Some whispered of poison. Others spoke of age and excess finally exacting their price. The cause mattered little. With his death, the last shield protecting Cesare vanished. What remained was a man feared, but no longer untouchable. Cesare attempted resistance, but power without legitimacy is fragile. He was betrayed by allies, captured by enemies, and driven far from Rome. His end came not in glory, but in obscurity. Killed in a minor conflict, abandoned by those who once flattered him, remembered not as a ruler, but as a warning. Thus ended a dynasty that had dared to eclipse kings, manipulate faith, and turn the Vatican into an instrument of domination. The Knights of the Borgias did not disappear into silence. They became stories passed down as cautionary echoes, not because of their excess, but because of what they revealed about power itself. Every age produces men who believe themselves beyond consequence. Every age proves them wrong. Power sustained by fear and indulgence eventually collapses under its own weight. Silk decays. Wine turns sour. Desire fades. And reality, unyielding, indifferent, always collects its debt. History does not forget such lessons. It waits for them to be repeated.